Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started here in about 30 seconds. We just want to make sure that we're doing well with our time today. We have a lot to get through. So thanks for joining us. And we'll just give people just a little while longer, and we'll start right on the time of 2:30, which is literally right now. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure more folks will be trickling in. My name is Cami Sacco, and I am a climate programs manager at Second Nature. My role is a regional focus role. They are being piloted with Second Nature to see if regional focuses make sense. So if you are in the Midwest region, which is my region, please go ahead and reach out. Our emails will be at the slideshow at the end of the webinar. So we'll go ahead and get started and dive in quick. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then I'll introduce our panelists, Brad, Kate, and John. So bear with me for just a moment, and then we'll pull back out for a second for introductions. All right, so welcome again, and thank you for joining us. So as you can see, the title of this webinar is How to Get It Done, and not how to get it done right, and not just get it done. To strategically engage stakeholders along your climate action planning journey to embed implementation. So here is just a little idea of the agenda for today, just to give you, a way to see what we're going to be talking through throughout the next 55 minutes or about an hour. So we're excited to chat more with y'all. And if you would, throughout the webinar, put your questions in the Q&A so we can have those kind of lined up if something comes up in the meantime. And you're also welcome to do any type of chatting throughout. And if you have tips that you've been through within your own climate action process, please put those in. We are here to learn from each other. So here's an idea of what we'll be going through within the next hour. So for those of you who don't know who Second Nature is, our mission is to accelerate climate action in and through higher education. And within that, we have our three climate leadership commitments. We have our carbon commitment, which is focused on eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have our resilience commitment, which is more focused on building resilience within your institution. And then lastly, the climate commitment is a combination of both of those. This is a little bit of a history of the Climate Leadership Network. As some of you know, it started in 2006 with the American Colleges, Universities President's Climate Commitment, and then has since evolved into what we have now. And some of you are included in us starting to think about commitments 3.0, which we're still in the process of gathering. We'll be gathering some more input from our members within the next coming months. We've done a little restructuring of the team. And so we have, we're ready to start to dive back into those here within the next couple months to make sure we get all our member input for those in the next form of our commitments. So this is a little idea of who Second Nature is. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce our panelists. And what they are going to do is just do a little bit of a dive into their university structures as well as their climate action planning, specifically for their institution. So let's see. So first we have Kate Nelson, who is the Director of Campus Sustainability with the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And then we have Brad Spanbauer, the Sustainability Director at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And lastly, we have John Gardner, the Interim Office of Sustainability Manager with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm so thankful that each of them have joined us, and we've had some really great conversation around this. And one thing that I want to say just before I hand it over to each of them is that we all know that climate action planning is an ongoing process and that none of it is perfect. I don't think there will ever be a perfect climate action plan or process. So we're all here to learn and to learn together. So again, if you have any tips that you've learned from in the past, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And we're here, like I said, to learn from each other. So I will hand it over to Kate first, and then we'll move to Brad and then John. So thanks again for being here, everyone.
Yes, thank you all. So to introduce you to myself, it's better to show the two organizations I've worked with in my career. And so I just arrived at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus, and I spent 15 years as the director of sustainability for UW-Milwaukee. Face plant to grow where you're planted. So think about stakeholder engagement, and change moves at the speed of trust. And so big, huge difference here for me. I'm building relationships and so forth. Relationships were really important at UW-Milwaukee, and I will always say that it was with ease to bring people to the table. We had a sustainability plan in 2010. That was part of our master plan, and the climate action plan was a carbon and resilience plan, and it was much easier to dive into the roles of the campus, especially governance. Another big difference was time versus little time at UWM, as John will share. Lots of preparation. We were starting in 2017 when there weren't a lot of resilience plans out there. So we had the grad class, a graduate class help us prepare. We actually did a plan for the plan. Lots of project charter that we wrote, a lot of buy-in, sign off from leadership. And this was, of course, in my court, whereas at University of Minnesota, a lot of that similar type of thing was already happening. But at the University of Minnesota, it's been a bit more of a top-down approach, where the system strategic plan, which is called MPAC 2025, called out a request for climate action plans. So very different process. Kind of more in the actual planning with stakeholders at UW-Milwaukee was a 2-year engagement process versus 6 months. At the University of Minnesota, we just brought our climate action plan to the Board of Regents last week at the University of Minnesota. So just to further emphasize, at the University of Minnesota, it is a carbon commitment. So the climate action plan actually was a mitigation plan and a resilience assessment. And now the resilience plan is now kicking off, since we have now brought the plan to the Board of Regents. At UW-Milwaukee, it started with a climate commitment. So we went full in on mitigation planning and resilience assessment and planning there. So next slide. Okay, thank you. And so place-based. I'll give Shane some credit here. At the University of Minnesota, he is now the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Minnesota system. And you can't pick up and move a university. A business might realize that climate is a threat. They can pick up and move, that we cannot pick up and move. And for me, I've really been sitting the last 6 months with living on a great river versus a great lake. And you wouldn't think that darn lake would have such an impact on the community, but I can really say that it does. So these are unique communities. You wouldn't think there's a big difference between Wisconsin and Minnesota. I'm really finding that there is, and I'm still in the very, very early stages of this. Very different knowledge base of climate. The lake made us very aware of our climate, and weather was so extreme by the lake that it is just not in inland. And so there's also a difference in the community, of course. There's different research focused on campus. Who do you tap? They are both R1 institutions, but UW-Milwaukee also had an access mission, so very different there. Different economy, obviously different size, enrollment, and so forth. But these factors really play into your stakeholders.
All right, I'm gonna go through a little bit of the UW-Oshkosh timeline and sort of our process that really follows when I took over the office full time on July 1st of 2020. So I was really using fall of 2020 to do some data analysis. So really looking at our historical energy data, but always thinking about climate action and resilience planning in the back of my mind. And at that point, I hadn't even, I would say, really fully considered the resilience piece. But I've learned from the folks who I'm sharing this panel with along the way, which is awesome. So in January of 21, what was at that time our Campus Sustainability Council, we had a meeting to reset. And so we met as a group. We invited our chancellor and our provost and really went through our historical energy data. And I was really trying to say, like, we need to take things more seriously. We need to get a plan in place. We need to really start these processes. Previously, we had been a carbon commitment signatory with Second Nature and previously ACU PCC. I made the recommendation in fall of 21 that we move to a climate commitment to, again, bring in that resilience piece. There were other things happening in fall. I applied for the pro bono consulting offer that Second Nature does. I can't say enough good about that program, and I'm happy to chat more with folks about that. But I would say, as those opportunities become available, apply for them. If you don't get them, apply for them the next time. Really, really worthwhile process. And then I, based on the recommendation of our chancellor and provost, we moved our what was called Campus Sustainability Council, which had previously been just an ad hoc committee since 2007, into a formally recognized shared governance representation committee for UW-Oshkosh. Then in spring of 2022, after lots of other work happening in the background, a lot of really awesome things happened. Our chancellor officially signed the climate commitment with Second Nature. So we took that step to bring and kind of broaden our commitment and bring the resilience piece in. And then we were selected for the climate action planning pro bono work with Second Nature. So that happened in summer of 22. So we really, stepped into I would say, more of the climate action side. But certainly, resilience was talked about and was in some ways woven in there. But more formally, our resilience planning process, which again, really drew some inspiration. And I learned a lot from John and Kate, also from using the Nature Conservancy, their framework. We began our process looking more at resilience. So just within the last few months, we've been holding listening sessions. We put out a survey to our entire university committee, again, really focused on how do we build a more resilient university. All the while we've been sort of drafting and starting to weave together what will be formally our kind of white paper, which is our climate action resilience plan. That will culminate this Friday in a summit that we're having for our institution. And then that work will kind of continue this summer, weaving the climate action piece and the resilience piece together. So that gives you a little bit of the history of sort of where we're at in the process.
Good afternoon, all. Well, yeah, echoing Kate's thoughts on the importance of place-based climate action planning and stakeholders. With Milwaukee, we'd like to acknowledge that we're on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigami, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, and where Milwaukee, Menominee, and the Kinnickinnic rivers meet. And the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Mohican nations remain present. Next slide. UWM is comprised of about 24,000 students, over 4,000 full-time employees, and 3 campuses. The primary Kenwood campus, as you can sort of see from this picture, is on Milwaukee's east side. Lake Michigan's there in the back left. And we also have a host of other buildings scattered throughout Milwaukee and southeast Wisconsin, as well as 2 two-year campuses, UWM at Washington County and UWM at Waukesha. About 38% of undergrads are first-generation college students. We're an R1 research university with a dual access and research mission. And we pride ourselves on having over 3,000 partnerships with businesses, nonprofits, and other community organizations. Our climate action carbon and resilience plan combines both the mitigation and the adaptation sides of the climate planning spectrum in order to both minimize our environmental impact as well as plan responses to those climate impacts that we can't avoid. So looking at our timeline, as Kate mentioned, it took us a while. So if we started off in 2017, we did a lot of pre-planning work, developing a project charter on what the timeline, what the scope was going to be, who was going to be involved, the capacity that we were going to ask for, the time that we were going to ask for from campus stakeholders. And that was a really important document to get us started and to start laying those things out. From there, we were also serendipity, very lucky to participate in a regional resilience plan with our Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. And they were developing a regional plan for 17 communities in Southeast Wisconsin. And Kate and I consulted on that plan. So it was great to see the inner workings of planning work going on, excuse me, in Southeast Wisconsin, not at UWM. And we use that to really inform our process. We started our resilience assessment probably in the fall of 2019, and all the group work that we started in the spring of 2020. We had about maybe a month or 6 weeks of in-person meetings before COVID hit. And so we had to take a pause, deal with a lot of really mission critical spring and summer planning. And then in the fall, we used that summer basically to pivot our entire planning process to be online. And so over the next year, we finished our resilience assessment and then got into the mitigation and climate solution planning work all online in 2021. And then we actually had our shared governance, so student senate, faculty senate, university staff senate. Approved our plan in February of 22, and now we're full swing into implementation. So I'd like to take a little step back and talk a little bit more about the process that UWM had while we developed our climate action carbon and resilience plan. So that first phase, that preparation phase, it really was around the timeline, who was going to do the work, getting our leadership commitment, who we wanted to be at the table and try to make that as comprehensive as possible. The phase one was really the baselining, assessing our climate hazards for Milwaukee. At the time, downscaled climate data wasn't quite where it is now. So it's a little bit more Wisconsin focused as a whole, with Milwaukee tie-ins due to our lovely lake. Along with that baselining was the emissions baselining from our greenhouse gas inventory, and then working on our resilience assessment. And the stakeholders that we had involved in the resilience assessment, they really paved the path for a lot of the work that we did subsequently. The resilience planning is really visceral. People relate to it really, really strongly, and it provided a really great springboard for all the emissions considerations that we had later. So some things that might be a little bit more technical, folks understood why they were important because they were affecting them in ways that they could relate to. The third phase was all around developing, our mitigation and adaptation goals and solutions, our climate solutions, trying to tie in curriculum and research, as well as community partners. And that took place while we were also analyzing sort of the priorities of our resilience assessment. And then finally, writing the plan, getting the plan adopted with that governance endorsement, and then developing sort of catalytic projects, which we termed as sort of 5-year projects. I like to think of them as sandwich planning, where we're going from the top bun of meeting our big goals for emissions reductions or addressing really key vulnerabilities or strengths on the resilience side. The bottom bun being everything that we have done well so far in relation to that goal. And then all the tasty middle part of the sandwich, what we're trying to fill up. And so that first layer, that first 5 years is really what our catalytic projects are about. So next slide, please. So really our climate action planning developed through a bunch of planning and work groups. One group that's not on here that should be is our executive sponsors, our vice chancellors of our operational, academic, and student life divisions at UWM. They gave us the okay to do the work. They approved and supported the roles of some of the more involved advisory group members. And they acted as the link between the project, the plan, and the chancellor's office. The core group was a group that we formed right at the beginning of our pre-planning work, which was really provided in sort of like an internal sounding board for our process. What we were proposing, they monitored what we were doing. They gave us feedback on who should be included, if there was anything that we were missing, if there was anyone that should be at the table that had not been at the table. And then that group was responsible for reporting progress to the executive sponsors. The advisory group was a much larger group of faculty, staff, and students from across the university. They both had professional expertise on components of climate change impacts to the region. And they were also monitored the progress of some of those like subgroups that we developed that you can see below in the resilience assessment, the phase 1 and phase 2 pieces. And included in that advisory group were representatives from shared governance. So university staff, academic staff, and student senate. And fantastically, they reported back out to their respective senates on our progress as our plan took a bit. Also not included in this slide, but important, our internal staff, Kate and myself, and students in the School of Urban Planning at UWM. We facilitated all the meetings and workshops throughout the planning process. We communicated out on all phases of the plan. And we were really responsible for completing the plan, for designing it, for everything. So while we were working on our resilience assessment, you can see in their phase 1, we made 3 working groups comprised of both campus and community stakeholders. They were really comprised of people on, working on the ground, in particular, like fleet vehicle mechanics, preventative maintenance, environmental services staff, engineers, architects, planners, and faculty and students that had a particular topical interest in what we were discussing. After we completed the resilience assessment, we started work on developing climate solutions, and we created a new set of 3 groups. And so one group was focused on curriculum and research, one on community partnerships, and one on the more technical aspects of the mitigation planning. All along, those groups would go back to the advisory group for feedback and check-ins, and that eventually led to the adoption of our plan. We also incorporated a lot of these same stakeholders into our implementation teams, which we're working on right now. And so that was one of the best parts. A lot of the members of the advisory group served on 1 or 2 of these phase 1 or phase 2 groups, and that continuance in terms of engagement really helped us both get the plan adopted, as well as is greasing the wheels on the implementation side. And I'll stop there.
Sorry, I was on mute that whole time. What we're going to do now is transition just into a more questions for the panelists specifically, because this webinar is obviously within the title talking about stakeholder engagement, as well as embedding implementation into your planning process. So the first question that I'm going to pose to each of you, and I'll throw it to one of y'all, is just what are the best practices to embed implementation into your climate action plan? And I'll start with Kate, and then if you want to hand it off or somebody else jump in after she takes it.
I'll simply say that you can always evolve who is at the table. And something that I think we're doing really well here in Minnesota now is that we're creating a very intentional onboarding, offboarding process, because the strategies are moving into implementation steps. And so we're actually doing like a crossover in the work groups to those who've been part of the process all along, making sure that there's sort of almost like a welcoming committee, I would almost call it, to what do we need further? And I really will emphasize that this has been our chance to bring more people to the table who are the boots on the ground, who are affected. I guess I'll say this mostly on the resilient side, but also the champions. Like, you don't actually have everyone at the table, and that's okay. So it's been a little bit difficult because I'm getting to know people here in the last 5 months, but just creating a very intentional onboarding, offboarding.
I would add, and to echo, I think a lot of what's been said here already, just regular continuous stakeholder engagement. Get folks involved early, definitely involve those folks who are going to be involved likely with the day-to-day implementation and the work associated with implementation, like get their buy-in, have them involved in the process. I always say our facilities folks like know our buildings, like the back of their hand, they know them in and out. So those are the kinds of people you really want to have involved, from very early on in the process. An example I might give is I formed an energy team here at UW-Oshkosh. We didn't really have a group collectively looking at like energy information, financial information, how that relates to emissions, all of those like pieces where they intersect. So I pulled a team together with our new Office of Institutional Effectiveness, and that has facilities people, finance people, IT, res life, and it's really great. We try and meet almost monthly. It sometimes gets a little bit beyond that, 6 weeks or so. But we talk about projects. Right now, we're talking about bringing in IRA, right? As to Kate's point about evolve, you have to be sort of ready when things come your way to respond to them. So it's a really good group. We've actually been having really, really meaningful conversation. And a lot of that is tied to deferred maintenance and how we're going to implement, things related to resilience.
Yeah, I'd echo Brad and Kate as well. I mean, cultivating stakeholders throughout the process. If you are at the beginning, that's wonderful. You have a chance to lead people and walk down a path with them for a while, which is a really, really engaging and wonderful thing. As Kate said, like change moves at the pace of trust, and that trust is getting everybody into the room to talk. I think a lot of the most fun engagement pieces and discussions that we had in our plan were between folks across campus who don't get to talk to each other a lot. And that was, say students and engineers and preventative maintenance guys, along with faculty in mechanical engineering. And so there were a lot of different perspectives that constantly would sort of get rehashed, and new strategic light like thrown on something that hadn't been considered. And I think everybody really, from what we heard from our stakeholders, they really enjoyed that aspect of the planning. Like they didn't have that opportunity to have those types of discussions and to get those different perspectives on their daily work or on the overall functioning and strategy of the university. And they really, really liked that.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this a couple times, but just making sure to include the people that are on the ground, right? So the custodial staff, the mechanics, the people that are actually doing the work, versus sometimes folks that are higher up, like in a VP or a director position, don't have that exact experience. And so that could be really powerful for building those stakeholders and that engagement as well. Great. Well, the next question I have for y'all is just, I'm going to hop down to one that I think is really important, that do you guys have a best practice that you've learned to get governance buy-in or board of trustees or regents support? So we'll start with John there. And then if you want to hand it off to somebody else or one of the others can jump in.
Sure. And I think on this one, I'll actually defer to Kate because Kate did a lot of amazing work at UWM.
Yeah,
ensuring that our governance was included throughout the entire process, and it was amazing.
So I will say that one of the best moments of my career was the fact that all senates endorsed the climate action plan with the same language at the same time, with the same amount of interest and excitement around it. And that almost meant more to me than the actual plan, that we had such deep excitement around it. And it was by what John was referring to. They were part of the process all along. I had a rep from each. And we would actually have our own like governance reps meetings when things were especially getting closer. Say like, what question, like, what is the viewpoint of academic staff? Or what is the viewpoint of university staff, students? Like, how can I be best prepared to answer questions when they get to, we went through committee and then to the full Senate for each of them. So given some context here, so at UW-Milwaukee, it was very important for us to have the campus like sign off on it, endorse it. It was not something that would go to the higher level system. At the University of Minnesota with the MPAC 2025 that I mentioned, it was very much like that's part of the pace was that we needed to bring this to the Board of Regents, which we just did successfully last Thursday. But even there, that wasn't really like there was no vote on it. But I can tell you, I also had, because they were so well prepared by what the groundwork Shane and others had laid, they had very good questions. And we had one of our top like climate adaptation resilience scientists at the table with Shane. So we brought the science to the Board of Regents very distinctly. That was some of the best conversation I've ever seen. Total cost of ownership conversation. What's their role? Real estate, core curriculum, like really understanding the Board of Regents' role. And now we walked away from that thinking, how can we engage them further? Like everything from some jokes that were made about the chair and bike riding to having him lead a bike ride. Like, there are different platforms and ways to break down the hierarchy. And now we're discussing how to do that further and more intentionally. So your governance structures are going to look different. And there's a difference between like people signing off on it and maybe like a tier down or the people signing off on it who actually have to make a budget for it. And so there's a distinction there. It's really easy to be at the top and be like, yeah, this sounds great. And then, it comes down to the campus level leadership that actually needs to prioritize because there's opportunity costs when you're putting together a capital budget. So I'll stop there.
I would just add best practice. I think regular, open, transparent communication with your governance groups. As I've moved through this process, I've really tried to engage our 4 governance groups as much as possible and just keep them aware of the steps that we're taking along the process so that they're engaged, that they have opportunity to provide feedback, they have opportunity to possibly consider joining the Climate Action Committee. And so I just think that's a really important, probably one of the most interesting conversations we've had, I think, so far is after our pro bono consulting work finished, and I presented that plan to our governance groups. There were some really interesting responses by some of our faculty to that plan, and in particular, sort of the different financial model, sort of the business as usual model, and then the decarbonized and social cost of carbon piece woven into kind of that framing of the model that would get us to decarbonization and neutrality. So good to engage people, have conversation.
You want to add anything, John? Are you good?
I think the only thing I'd add would be to reinforce what Kate said about like democratizing the process. It is fascinating that this type of planning really can be used to break down a lot of silos on campus, or that's what we found. And even the way that we tried to host the sessions were really like everybody's just coming to the table. And so it was a different space for folks to engage in that I think was people could be very candid in, which was nice.
Thanks, John. One thing I'm gonna take a sidestep a little bit because you guys mentioned continuous stakeholder engagement and how important that is to the process. Can you give some examples about what that exactly is and what that means just for, just even like the logistics, what's an example of how you're continuously engaging them? Are you just giving them updates? Are you having them send questions? So what does that mean to each of you? And I'll let anybody take it that wants to take it first.
Sure, I'll take it first. I think for us, yeah, there's a lot of pre-planning work that goes into any of the meetings that we hold. And so there's definitely some touch points with stakeholders, even in that pre-planning stage. And then certainly during those meetings, during those events, having a lot ready for them to be as pointed and as prepared for their time as we can be. And then there's a fair bit of follow-up. I think we definitely had a lot of analysis that we would give to folks after meetings. We would provide summaries and meeting notes. And then we would also ask for additional feedback on anything that had been talked about, what we had missed, things like that. And so even though they might seem like sort of generalized pre-post meeting stuff, that really helped us. And specifically those folks who, if they were part of a group that went through the mitigation planning process, looking at scope 1 emissions, then we would make sure that, okay, on the implementation team, you were probably really important to keep involved in this process. And that really helped because they already knew the climate impact hazards. They were already familiar with the way that we were talking about things. And so over and over in meetings, we would sort of have a similar cadence to our presentation and flow to remind people of particular things. And I think that's paid off a little bit going forward.
I'll give like a real soft answer and then a real firm answer for you. At UW-Milwaukee, we had a continuing tension between School of Architecture and capital planning. And so when we're putting a meeting together, not everybody's schedules work, but I'd sit down with John and be like, I need these 2, 3, 4 people to be there because they are not having this conversation outside of this and they really need to. So to be like, and that's what comes from knowing a campus and having relationships and trust. At UMN, thankfully there was a team in place and a really spectacular project manager. But we had an open house in the beginning, a survey in the middle, and an open house near the end at the end of March. So those were some tools that you can really easily do. We did an open house as well at the end because we've been going through the pandemic at UW-Milwaukee. We really took the time to plan a really good in-person way of getting information from people in a very public space at UW-Milwaukee when things were starting to open back up. So we didn't skip that. It's harder to move people around in Zoom. Sometimes you want people to hop tables because you need to create these relationships. And like sometimes you just have to do these things in person. But actually, like at Minnesota, we have had a meeting every week about CAP engagement. So who's going to these neighborhood meetings? Who's presenting at the Dean's Council? Like we had a meeting every week with the entire team on planning just for engagement. So there was a lot there too. That was very intentional, very easy to break down and share with other campuses.
All right, so we'll transition. We only have a couple more minutes for this portion of the webinar. But the last question I think I'm going to ask you is that a lot of folks that had signed up for the webinar had expressed or let us know that they are trying to build resilience into their climate action plan. So what would be, again, your advice or best practice to actually build that in? I know Brad, you had mentioned using the Nature Conservancy, which is something that's a strong partnership between us. There was I think their resilience planning process, and that's something I've taken a part in as well with other campuses, and that's been really strong, and I'm happy to drop that in the chat if folks are interested. But what are some other tips that you guys have to really start to pull that into the conversation and have it not just be focused on mitigation?
I would say lead with it. It's wonderful. It's way more visceral for stakeholders. You can talk about current impacts to climate hazards, and those types of conversations, people start relating to what the effects of these emissions are in ways that they hadn't before. And we found at UWM that the mitigation solution, that like those discussions were way easier to have after we had the resilience discussions. Also, I would say if at all possible, like even if you're just doing mitigation planning, weave in resilience. Because you definitely want to consider trade-offs and co-benefits too, right? Like if you're building a giant seawall of concrete that's doing a wonderful job of keeping campus from flooding. Well, if you're using a ton of concrete that is producing a bunch of emissions, those are things that you should be talking about. And conversely, you could say like the co-benefits of taking out a fossil fuel burning heat plant and the attendant health benefits on your local campus population. So I would say lean into resilience plan.
It is the best way to reach everyone you've wanted to have a more intentional purpose with: essential workers, people who work outside, vulnerable communities. And again, I think this goes back to the trust that have been built. We had the diversity, equity, inclusion is very spread across UWM. It's kind of the thing we want for sustainability, right? And so like by developing all those relationships, getting everybody to the table, we were finally able to like put some real intention behind the work we want to do together. And flooding doesn't stop at the border of your campus. Like there's not some magical wall, so you have to be working with the community, thinking about a watershed approach. Fits more naturally than like your heat plant, something like that.
I would echo everything John and Kate have said. I mean, I think you have to make this relatable to people and for people, and resilience is relatable.
Yeah, it definitely feels like an entry point for people versus trying to talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 around emissions. We all have jargon that exists in our fields. So, okay, well, great. Thanks y'all for those answers. And so what we're gonna do now is John is just gonna pull up something called a mural board, which some of you may have experience in doing and some may not. He just dropped the link in the chat. So you're welcome to click on that, and he's going to share his screen. And then we'll end with 15 minutes for questions, because we just want to get a little bit more of an idea of why you guys are here and, specific questions that you're grappling with within your individual institution. So I'll hand it back over to you, John, and then we'll try and exit out. Maybe 3:17 is fine, I think.
I will be brief. Okay, can everyone see this now? Is that showing up?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. So just wanted to present a possibility for you to think through if you're at any point in the stakeholder, if you're in your climate action process and you're stuck at where do I even start? How do I incorporate stakeholders that haven't been to the table before? What should I be thinking about? Just really briefly, made a stakeholder engagement board that hopefully will help you start brainstorming some of those things or add to what you've already done. So really just quickly, this will be up. The link is, it's always up there, so feel free to take from it and do with it what you will. We did a lot of this stuff at UW-Milwaukee in our climate action planning process, really trying to delineate who our stakeholders were, and then at different steps within the process, what we needed to be thinking about. So like even in the pre-planning work, we were thinking about what, who's going to do that work? What's the timeline for it? If we're doing it internally as an office, what is our capacity? What are our strengths that we can draw on? And what are our weaknesses, most importantly, that we know we're going to need to go out and get help even before we start to do the planning work. And so we tended to use a bunch of these sort of Mad Lib-esque or like follow the box, put information in the box type whiteboard exercises. And this one, just really thinking about, your strengths, your needs and priorities as in your job, what constraints you have, time, labor, capacity, what weaknesses, what areas do you know you're going to need additional help in while you're developing your climate action plan that you don't have experience in, And based on that, what stakeholders are you going to need to reach out to? Just really start brainstorming those types of things. For plan development, if you're talking about baseline data, about where will that data come from? Who's involved in procuring and maintaining that data? What are their constraints? If you're going to someone and they only respond by email, okay, that's great. Now if they only respond by phone, got to change it up. Or if they only respond when you show up in person at their door, then you might have to do something a little bit different for that particular stakeholder. And you can really inform your outreach method and keep trying to figure out what works for that particular stakeholder. You could do the same thing with risk evaluation while you're developing solutions, developing your action plan, all those types of things. Particularly in the solution development side of things, one of the things that we did was really try to brainstorm who was involved in the activities related to those emissions. So if it was in scope 1 and it was fleet vehicles or on-campus energy sources, we would just brainstorm all the folks that we thought would have a touch point with that. Same goes for scope 2 or scope 3. And we would really use that to identify possible stakeholders. And then when we did outreach to them, we would ask them, who else should we contact about this particular thing? And so our list it just kept growing and growing. We also found that a lot of the resilient stakeholders, we did the same thing related to resilience assets, whether that's infrastructural assets, things like our buildings or utility infrastructure, environmental assets, important natural areas, and community assets. And then we started to see, okay, where did these stakeholders overlap? Who was involved in both? And that also informed a bit of how we approached those folks in terms of asking for their time and also leveraging their knowledge and expertise in one area to help inform the other area. So, for that, in that solution analysis type phase, we definitely looked at, if we had a particular climate solution, you would find as we brainstormed that particular stakeholder, we would delineate what their interest might be. So if they were maintenance staff and they were talking about reducing fleet emissions, maybe they've got to maintain those vehicles. Their constraint is that they don't have time to dedicate to longer term planning, maybe because they're constantly just under siege with the work that they have to do. And so our opportunity was to realize, okay, well, we need to be incredibly intentional with our outreach. Maybe it's just a series of lunch and learns when they are sort of free. And if we can meet them where they're at, then that'll really help us go forward and get their engagement. So hopefully this will be in any respect helpful to you. We'd be glad to talk about this at any time. And we developed, I don't know, dozens of boards like this throughout our process. And I will stop sharing now.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I think that's a really helpful tool to be able to map it. It seems like it could get overwhelming really quickly at the same time. So you got to be really well organized to be able to move through that for sure. Okay, so we knew this hour would go by really quickly. So we only have about 12 minutes left and we want to be respectful of your time. So we will end right at 3:30. So we'll start with the first question from Olivia. And she asks, did you request funding or new personnel to accomplish your tactics? So I'm going to start with Kate and then we'll hand it off.
This is like the difference between the two universities. The quick answer is no, but John and I, when we were at UW-Milwaukee, that was what we did. There's a lot of things you don't do when you're doing climate action plan. And I can't tell you enough how hard that is and yet how important it is to sort of say, this is our focus. This is the strategy we need to be focused even further beyond this plan. And so that was okay. We wrote a project charter, which I think was one of the most helpful things we did for the buy-in from leadership, who's involved. We had to go down in each phase to the very amount of hours we were asking of people. And our leadership would sign off. on that. So not only just our time and capacity, but everyone else's time. So no, yeah, and as John mentioned, like internally, we designed it. We did have a student who we put their time as well into the design and so forth. At University of Minnesota, I think they did a lot of things actually even 2 years ago to put capacity in place. I don't know if it was extra staffing or funding, but it was capacity. So like there's one really key person on the mitigation side who was moved up a notch in order to be able to like get out of the day-to-day work so that he could become a better planner, not only for the climate action plan, but also for we're working our way into a utility plan as well. That was a big one to me when I learned that. Shane being a chief sustainability officer for the university system, and then he hired Amanda, who is a project manager. So yes, and she has come in very well organized, having done lots of climate and resilience plans prior. Then getting my position filled, Shane's old position. So I really think a lot of that was driven by the need for planning. And the Minnesota system is 5 campuses. Twin Cities was the first to complete its climate action plan. So Amanda's actually, her capacity isn't just for Twin Cities, that's actually for all the campuses, climate action plans and stars. So there was a very deep need in the Minnesota side and planning and thoughtfulness going into that. In Milwaukee, it just meant that we were not doing other things.
Thanks, Kate. Any other quick responses from Brad or John? We have a couple more questions.
I would just say again, huge props to Second Nature for doing the pro bono consulting. Like that was very, very helpful to us. And really that was me responding to my chancellor saying, more doing, less planning. Like he was like, I want this to like move. And so the pro bono work, and when B&D came in as consultants and helped us in like 8 weeks over summer, really accelerated that process. And that was so helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. All right. Well, I'm going to hop down to Blythe's question. Olivia, I'll come back up to your second one if we have time. So what's an example of a challenge and engagement you've personally encountered that was unforeseen, and how did you navigate this? I'll just give it to anyone who wants to take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially we had a big wait for one particular sign off at UWM, and luckily, I mean, that was unexpected, but it actually helped us because we were able to prepare for a lot longer. So we used that time to really dig into the climate hazards, our process for the resilience assessment. That really helped us. And I would say the other big thing was just trying to schedule meetings between 30 to 50 people online. We tended to post lunch and learns, and like climate, we would say we're just going to use 1 hour of your lunch, and that's what we have to do because it was just impossible to schedule anything otherwise.
Anybody else want to take that? Thanks, John.
I think just coming into a new place, it was obvious to me from coming from having just done a climate action plan. So with resilience, I learned so much, and I showed up and there were people who I thought needed to be included in the work group who weren't there. Especially on the resilience side, because I took the lead on the resilience assessment at the University of Minnesota. And that means more time. Like that means stop, hit the brakes, have coffee with somebody. And I've been like having massive amounts of coffee time with people because I need more engagement, and I refused to move forward when there wasn't more campus community, vulnerable community engagement at the table. So I really had to like hit the brakes and turn, and I was new, but that's the way you get it done right. That just was, it was more painful for me because I did not operate like that at UW-Milwaukee.
Yeah, it sounds like just slowing down overall, of like making sure that you're not trying to speed through, just getting it done. So Brad, if you have anything to add, maybe put it in the chat, just because I want to try and get to at least these 2 questions from Jennifer and Aaron. So Aaron asks, do you have any experience in getting buy-in from facilities staff that are very busy, have been doing have been doing things the same for a long time, the same way for a long time, and may be reluctant to change?
Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned before, I started this like energy team. And yeah, I would say very much that is our experience here at UW-Oshkosh. Our facilities folks, we have open positions. They are very busy. They need to deal with day-to-day, day-to-day duties. And so it at first was hard to really get them to set some time aside and dedicate some time to sit down and talk through this stuff. But once we did, it was so fascinating to see, and I wasn't surprised by it at all, but we do have a lot of folks in facilities who see this stuff, they care about this stuff, and they're thinking in the ways that I think a lot of sustainability professionals think about, like long-term planning and resilience and building all of that into, thinking about deferred maintenance, all of those things. So it's there. I really like Kate's quote. Kate, if this is your quote, change moves at the pace of trust. I love that. It is, you have to build relationships with these people. Again, I had this energy team. We all meet pretty regularly, but often a lot of folks like aren't there just because they are out, they're electricians and plumbers and they're out, HVAC folks doing things. So I say, when can I come to you? Like, when can I pull 3 of you aside and sit down and talk about some stuff that we really need to talk about? Because I think building that relationship is important, and that's been very helpful. We had been doing virtual meetings, and our last meeting, I said, I would really like us to all meet in person and talk through this stuff. And it was by far the best meeting we've had yet. I also think getting them in a space where they see this stuff as resilience, right? For them, it's just like, oh, this is what I do, or this is my day. But like, I think if you can kind of get that framing or get them to shift, a little bit in their mind, like, oh, that's what this means. This means like, we really need to think about building a resilient university moving forward.
Thanks, Brad. Kate or John, you want to take that?
I think just real briefly, I would say, one of the nice things about being virtual the entire time was we had to be really strict with what we were asking. And that limited the amount of different conversations or anybody bogarting a conversation that could easily happen in any sort of climate solution meeting, right? So I would recommend having really pointed questions and really pointed facilitation. That made things go much smoother for us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Having very specific asks, right? Cool, thank you. So I'll put both of these together, and whichever one you guys want to answer, you are welcome to. The one from Jennifer is, did you end up making any significant changes to your nearly final plans after first presenting it to leadership, or did you already have their feedback integrated from stakeholder engagement? And then Olivia asked, what type of events did you host to engage students throughout the planning process, and any lessons learned associated?
Can you just read it one more time?
Yes. Which one?
The beginning.
Yep. Did you end up making significant changes to your nearly final plans after first presenting it to leadership, or did you already have their feedback integrated from stakeholder engagement? And then the second one is related to student engagement.
I'll jump on the first one. So I started in January, and we actually had to bring the climate action plan to campus leadership by April 17th. See how I know those days, right? And that meant that leadership had anyone who would have to like call out a red flag before it got to the Board of Regents. They had a chance to do so, but with a lot of turmoil in leadership, there's the incoming interim president, outgoing president. Their focus was a little bit diverted, but we really we got it done and gave them time. And then the team kept editing along the way. And it came back from Board of Regents with no further edits. So I guess I can't reflect on that, but I think it has to do with they were part of it all along. They were, different. I know I'm speaking to different levels of leadership. They were part of it all along. And so there's no surprises, or there shouldn't be any surprises in coming with that. And John and I had a very distinct meeting with all the vice chancellors, our sponsors. And before we did the big open house finale, they were able to catch things or help us think through some really critical points. So that when we opened it up to the campus, none of that would, none of that dirty laundry, so to speak, would be aired or whatever it might be. Yeah, there's, it's like, they caught on right away at Minnesota, the rubber band effect of going in and out and in and out all the time. And how much time it takes to be strategic on that, like John was saying, is so important.
Anyone want to round us out?
But you did mention students, so student org, student government, there's so many different places and spaces, and you got to go to them. And I was really proud when there's a student rep on the Board of Regents for Minnesota that really called out and understood and saw the student engagement. And so it tells me, I guess we did a pretty good job in Minnesota. The thing that I'll like just sort of end with is that this type of work becomes second nature to us. Like, we know how important it is. Like, even when it's hard for us, we still know, like, I've got to reach that person, and you will constantly come in contact with people who are more familiar with more traditional planning processes. We do things differently to get a different outcome, right? And people aren't familiar with that. So don't be surprised when like you show a really good example of how stakeholder engagement with students, vulnerable communities is important, to have someone sort of question that. It's really funny how you evolve in this work and not everyone evolves at the same pace.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Kate. We're just a little bit over, so we want to thank you everybody for joining us. We know that this conversation could probably last for hours longer, but I dropped everybody's emails in the chat if you are interested in reaching out to someone specifically about something that they had mentioned. So we'll be sending out a survey tomorrow to gain some feedback. Please fill that out for us. We're really trying to learn how to help members and non-members to, move the work forward. That's why we're all here. So thank you again. And thank you to Kate, John, and Brad for their time. And I hope you all have a good rest of the day. Bye, y'all.